Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Szekely. I'm a co-founder with Salons for Life. And today I'm with our upcoming salon facilitator for the September 10th salon, Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I want to know a little bit about who you are. I know you have a book that you've been over the course of 20 years, right? Living with the text, translating it. When did the book come out?
So the Kural, which is a classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love that I studied years ago with my Tamil teacher, the late Dr. Kube Ramakodi, and which he would hint to me should be translated well in a literary and poetic fashion into English. This is a book I've lived with for more than 20 years, and then I've been translating for the last 5 years. The book just came out from Beacon Press this past January, and is making its way into the world. It has the distinction of being really a masterpiece of world literature, easily on par with works like the Tao Te Ching or the Bhagavad Gita or the poetry of Rumi. But because of the idiosyncrasies of history, has not really become well known yet in English, in the English-speaking world. And yet, to me, remains a remarkably relevant, deeply relevant, vibrant, playful work that I'm really excited to share with people.
How did you come to translating specifically this little known, at least in the West? I mean, I hadn't heard of the Kural before this, but how did you get into that realm? Were you always interested in it, or did you start in one thing and it led to another? What was that journey?
Well, there's a very long journey. Let me see if I can sort of encapsulate the essence of that journey. Part of that journey had to do with how studying the Tamil language, which I began after graduating from college, and that's a whole story there, how that came to be. But in the process of learning this other language, which I originally wanted to learn so that I could live in a village and experience something of a rooted community life, that was my primary aim for the first several years, and has continued to be an aim in the years since. I didn't actually have much interest in learning to read and write or to explore the literature. I had sort of given up reading altogether so that I could really enter an oral world, a world of spoken, not just spoken language, but of story and song. But my teacher, being the extraordinary teacher that he was, would keep building my enthusiasm, kindling my excitement, and suggested it'd be a good idea for me to learn and to read and write. And then he introduced me to poetry in a way that made it come alive to me in a way that I never really experienced it in school, where it actually, I think much of my schooling had killed the experience of poetry.
What's the author's intent for this? Then it just zaps all creative play.
Like dissecting a frog, you take the poem apart, and, you pull out the dead organs. You're like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
And I found myself returning to, after I had a 2.5-year stint there, and then I was there for half a year, and then I went back on a Fulbright for a year, and I wanted to explore the relationship between people and place, or between land and language, both in the spoken language of a village I came to live in, but also in the literature. And so we started to read some of the great ancient works of poetry, including the Kural or the Tirukural, to use the full name in Tamil. And at the time, my only interest was to enter the world of this poem. And it's a philosophical poem, which is very interesting to me because I had actually studied philosophy as an undergraduate. I had a deep interest. I continue to have a deep interest in big questions of how do we live? How do we determine what is a right action? What is beauty? What is goodness? But of course, in the Western tradition, philosophy kind of broke away from poetry very early on, so that you have sort of philosophy becomes more and more dry and abstract and academic and logical. And then poetry sort of becomes more and more a specialty on its own, obscure, maybe difficult to understand, difficult seeming at least to understand, maybe removed from our everyday world, and maybe even removed from these big questions we all, I think, have in the depths of our hearts. So I was fascinated at the beginning with a work which brings poetry and philosophy. It doesn't even bring them together, they already are together. They
Mm.
already are of a piece. And in the years since I studied we studied it very intensely. It has these very short verses. They're less than 2 lines long, and there's 1,330 of them. And I memorized more than half of them, as trying to get the poetry into my body as well as into my ear and my mind. Um, and we read all the ancient commentaries from the 11th, the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. But I never had any thought of translating the work. I really just wanted to enter into it. In fact, I wanted deliberately not to think in English at all, so that I could think in the language of the work. But in the years since, my teacher would say things as we spoke on the phone or when I would go to visit him. Somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of this work. And I'd always say, of course, somebody should do that. There must be some PhD candidate somewhere. Jump on that task. And then it finally occurred to me 12 years later, I might give it a try. And I think 2 things. One, I think because my teacher himself was a poet, he knew not to push it. He knew that either it would occur to me or it wouldn't, and that it did. And I think for my own self, I was on my own journey as a poet, as a writer, exploring language, not only Tamar, but also English and also Spanish and some ancient Greek. I had to get to a place with my own capacity and facility as a poet to even dare to attempt to approach a work like this. And then when it was time, it was time. And I dove in. I went back to India. It was my last time spent with my teacher in person, going through the entire manuscript, improving it as best as I could, following his suggestions and his deepening comments and commentary. And so it was very much a project that I had not set out to do, but rather one that presented itself as something I've been being prepared to do long before I was able to say yes to it. And then I'm glad to have been able to say yes to it, and that it's come out in a form that I think will be very meaningful for people.
Now, you said you lived with the text, which I think is very interesting, because I think there's probably very few texts, maybe the Bible, maybe some Shakespeare in the Western canon, that people maybe not every day, but regularly come into contact with. But it's often a very intellectual endeavor, and maybe not so much a lived one, depending on maybe through prayer, or if you're a performer, you have to live and with text. What was your experience like when you say you were living with the text? And specifically in the context of this salon, we're talking about embodying poetry. And I know, like in Shakespeare's time, they would say, we're going to hear a play, because you literally couldn't see it, because in some of parts of the groundlings, you couldn't actually see the stage. So you actually had to hear the text, and that had an emotional response, hopefully, to the viewer. So what was it like in your experience to live and embody these words and subsequently write them back down again, but in a different language?
Yeah. Well, I love that you mentioned Shakespeare, because there is a way in which, there are phrases of Shakespeare that people maybe have never heard a Shakespearean play, to be or not to be, or something like that. This is the winter of our discontent. Now is the winter of our discontent, or whatever it might be. But for me, I remember I had a similar experience with Shakespeare, which is that I studied it in school, and I look up the glosses for the words, but it was a chore, right? It's kind of an academic task. But when I had a chance to perform Shakespeare and was memorizing the words, I was like, oh, now I can start to guess. There's this life in that process of getting them by heart, acting, embodying, speaking them out, playing with them. And I had a similar experience. I memorized all of my favorite verses at one point, so that I could have them with me, so that I could live with them longer than that first reading or that first hearing, and return to them, come back to the sounds of them. And so it's like I love the phrase learning by heart, because it was a getting it by heart, getting it into the heart and not just the head.
I never thought of it that way. That makes so much sense when you say it, but it's just another one of those rote things. Oh, you learn it by heart.
And I think that, the potential is that we, because of the way reading has evolved in the quote unquote Western world, we often read silently. We often read for information. but the reading that and the hearing that is invited into our experience with a poem joins the intellect with the heart, with the body, with the very breath, the musculature of our speaking apparatus, the physicality of our ears, so that learning a poem by heart, improvising a poem out loud, it brings us into the realm of, say, music, or like a great classical South Indian singer improvising a melody, or a great jazz musician improvising a lick. And that brings us, it doesn't exclude the intellect, but it places the intellect, or the sort of rational part of our minds, in a much wider context. A context of play, of flesh and blood, of the emotional texture of words and sounds in our experience. And so I think at its best, living with a poetic text, like Shakespeare, like the Kural, like Rumi, like all of these great experiential embodied poets, is helps us reconnect and reunite parts of ourselves, reintegrate ourselves into a more dynamic and living whole fabric, if you will.
I totally agree. So much of the time we live between here and here, and there's actually, we think with our whole body. I mean, the central nervous system extends all the way from the brain all the way down the spine. And I had a teacher once that would say, how do you think with your whole spine?
Yes.
And I think that's a really important thing that perhaps we're losing a lot because of the nature of how we communicate.
Yeah.
And I think words are really important because they're all we have to take the invisible and make it visible, to take the intangible and make it tangible. So I think I know that I use this in my daily life often, so it's good to always exercise that muscle. But in your mind, who else do you think would benefit from, besides everyone, from experiencing this sort of workshop type that we're going to do in the salon?
Well, there's two more people that sort of come as images into my mind. One is people who feel like they're on the edge of even understanding poetry. Like, kind of interesting. You have friends who maybe read poetry, but you're not necessarily drawn to it, but you're curious. And you're curious, what is it that people get from a poem that I may or may not be experiencing? Because this is very much an exploration that I hope will be nourishing for people like that, because I was that person for a very long time, aware of poetry, but not able to enter it as an experience. And what I've tried to do with this translation is to really offer not just a kind of transcription of the quote unquote meaning of each of these verses, but to suggest something of the experience somebody has listening to one of these verses, which in the original, the context of South India, for instance, these are verses that people just know, and you might suddenly quote in a conversation with someone because it's apt to purpose. It speaks to us. And I also have been really interested. I've been connecting with a number of young Tamil American men and women, people who are for whom they've grown up, their parents or aunties or uncles have spoken of this work, but they haven't found a way to enter into it themselves. And sometimes you can find translations of the work where not only is the translation very wooden, but even just from the very cover onward, it may seem something very removed from our daily lives, and maybe something even a little bit stodgy, ethics, sort of a moralistic kind of, do this, thou shalt not do that, or something like that. Whereas it's really a very playful, life-affirming set of poems, interweaving of poems into a whole poem. And I just got an email from a friend, and she has a friend growing up in a Tamil family in the United States, and he bought 2 copies, one for himself and one for his mother, and they've been reading it together. And then for the first time, they're able to connect around this particular work. And so I'm also particularly keen for people who may have that that background and that experience to explore in this embodied and maybe for people unusual way, which then I think can ripple out to how people experience whatever language or poetry or artistic expression is, germane to their own tradition, experience, or the inclinations of their own hearts.
That's what I was just going to add too. I think, and as you all will release a little teaser of what Thomas will do and practice and guide you through in the salon. But what I just experienced, that I think if you're creatively inclined in any sort of modality, I think this is a great way to kind of unblock yourself, or at least step out of your own way, because we'll be listening to things in English, which I imagine is, if not a primary, but a commonly spoken language for a lot of our salon attendees. And then perhaps to shift to a language in which many might have no relationship to hear it and experience what it's like to just have a reaction to that when you're not trying to devise meaning out of it, when you're just responding and listening. And I think that sort of perspective shift can be really good in, if you have like a quote unquote writer's block or something like that, it might activate a part of your mind that you might not have access to or not have communication with as well.
I think that would be another of my own hopes for participants, for all of us together in our time together.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas. Is there anything you'd like to share before I close us out?
Just that I'm honored to be involved with Salons for Life, and I'm very excited to play and explore together in what I hope will be a very meaningful and musical, if you will, embodied exploration of the power of not just language, but of sound to move our hearts and to move our thinking to a new place.
And if people are interested in purchasing your book and reading a little bit about it, can they visit your website?
Yes, there's a page on my website, thomaspruiksma.com. And you can read more about, not only read about the book, but I have a series of videos. You can listen to me share some of these verses out loud in both the original language and in my translation, as well as some longer interviews with people, spiritual leaders, healers, teachers, musicians, including people who have no connection, no previous connection to the language, but we explore some 2 or 3 verses together, just to get a sense for the relevance of the work. One of my favorite interviews is with a painter, and we talk about the way that the poet of Kural speaks of being able to read a person's face, and she's a portrait painter, and it's a particularly delightful conversation about how we sense another's heart as we see it in their faces.
That's fascinating. And I'll be sure to put all of the links to those places in the comments. Thank you so much, Thomas. Please, everyone, join us September 10th. It's a Saturday morning, 10:30 to noon Eastern Standard Time. So it might not be morning, depending on where you're logging in from. And you can register by following. We'll post the links in the comments, as well as the final screen in this YouTube channel video. Thomas, thank you so much. I really am looking forward to having you guide us on a full hour-and-a-half experience with this text.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.